Europe at a turning point, between the freedom of the 90s and the anxiety of the present. When the Berlin Wall collapsed under the blows of sledgehammers and cheering, it seemed that history had written its final verdict. Europe of the 90s was bathed in the euphoria of victory, ideological, cultural, economic. The continent, divided by the Iron Curtain for almost half a century, suddenly found itself united, free and looking forward to a future that seemed cloudless. 35 years later, the same Europe looks in the mirror and sees a completely different reflection, tired, wary, split along new fault lines. The 90s were a time of great illusions. Francis Fukuyama proclaimed the end of history, and Europe believed in it with all its heart. The youth of Prague, Budapest, and Warsaw were reading Western magazines, which were contraband yesterday, but today they were lying on every corner. McDonald's on Red Square has become a symbol not just of globalization, but of the triumph of a certain lifestyle. Borders were disappearing at an astonishing rate, first ideological, then physical. The Schengen area turned travel into entertainment, not a bureaucratic nightmare. Economic optimism permeated the air. Germany, united, became the locomotive of the continent. Eastern European countries greedily absorbed Western investments and knowledge, and their economies grew at double-digit rates. Privatization, liberalization, deregulation. These words sounded like spells opening the door to prosperity. The city of London was turning into a global financial center, and Dublin was becoming a Celtic tiger from the periphery. Unemployment was falling, wages were rising, and the middle class was expanding in all directions. The cultural scene was exploding with colors. Berlin became the capital of the underground, where techno clubs were born in the abandoned buildings of the former East Berlin, which defined the sound of an entire generation. British pop music was experiencing the heyday of Britpop, French cinema was experimenting, Scandinavian design was conquering the world. The internet was just beginning its journey, and this novelty seemed exceptionally liberating. An uncensored space where everyone is equal, where information flows freely. The political landscape of the 90s looked predictably stable. The centrist parties dominated, the left and the right moved towards the middle, forming the third way of Tony Blair and Gerhard Schroeder. European integration seemed like a natural, irreversible process. The Maastricht Treaty laid the foundation for a single currency that was supposed to cement the Union forever. NATO expanded eastward, offering not only military protection but also political stability. Russia looked weak and chaotic, immersed in its own problems. Immigration existed, but did not dominate the public discourse. Europe accepted people, believing in its ability to integrate them. Multiculturalism was a buzzword, a symbol of openness and progress. Refugees from the Yugoslav wars spread across the continent, and this was perceived as a humanitarian mission, not an existential threat. The Europe of 2025 lives in a completely different reality. The optimism of the 90s now looks naive. The continent faced a series of crises, each of which undermined the foundations of what seemed to be an eternal order. The 2008 financial crisis shattered faith in self-regulating markets and exposed the fragility of the European financial system. The Eurozone debt crisis nearly tore apart the monetary union, leaving scars of mistrust between North and South. The migration crisis of 2015 was a turning point. Millions of people fleeing wars in the Middle East and Africa poured into Europe, and the continent was not ready, either practically or psychologically. Images of overcrowded boats, endless columns of refugees, and the terrorist attacks in Paris and Berlin have forever changed European consciousness. Multiculturalism has turned from an ideal into a source of discord. Populism, which seemed marginal in the 90s, has taken center stage. Right-wing parties, from the national unification in France to the alternative for Germany, have turned from outcasts into influential political forces, and in some countries even form governments. Brexit was a shock that refuted the idea of the irreversibility of European integration. Hungary and Poland openly defied the Brussels bureaucracy, defending a liberal democracy. Russia has turned from a weak partner into an aggressive opponent. The annexation of Crimea, the war in Donbass, and then the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 destroyed the remnants of illusions about the end of history. Europe has once again found itself on the front line, forced to accept millions of Ukrainian refugees and relearn how to think about security in military terms. Energy dependence on Russia turned into a vulnerability that had to be urgently overcome. The economic picture has also changed. Growth has slowed, especially compared to dynamic China and India. Industry is migrating to Asia. Young people are facing precarization of labor, temporary contracts, gig economy, lack of social guarantees. The housing crisis has transformed owning your own home from the norm into an unattainable dream for many. The middle class feels under pressure, their confidence in the future is undermined. The climate crisis has turned from an abstract threat into a tangible reality. Heat waves are killing thousands of people, forests are burning from Portugal to Greece, and floods are flooding cities. The green transition has become an imperative, but it also provokes resistance. The protests of the yellow vests in France began precisely with indignation at the environmental fuel tax. The technological euphoria of the 90s has also evaporated. The internet, which promised freedom and democratization, has given rise to new forms of control, manipulation, and polarization. Social media has created echo chambers where people hear only what they want to hear. Fake news and disinformation undermine the common space of facts. Europe has lagged behind in the digital race. The largest technology companies are American and Chinese, and European regulation looks like an attempt to catch up with the departing train. The cultural climate has become tense. The wars of memory have flared up with renewed vigor. Disputes about the colonial past, about monuments, about teaching history. The culture of abolition and the debate about the limits of freedom of speech are splitting society. The younger generation, who grew up in anxiety and uncertainty, looks at the future without the optimism that their parents had in the 90s. The social contract, which seemed solid, is bursting at the seams. Pension systems are overloaded with an aging population. Healthcare is experiencing a chronic shortage of resources, which was especially pronounced during the COVID-19 pandemic. Education is becoming more and more elitist, and social elevators are getting stuck. The European project, once the epitome of progress, is now perceived by many as part of the problem rather than the solution. Brussels is accused of being out of touch with reality, of being bureaucratic, and of imposing uniformity. The single currency, designed to unite, has exposed deep economic differences. The overall migration policy has failed, and each country is acting in its own way. The intergenerational gap has deepened. Young people accuse the older generation of having squandered the future, ecologically, economically, and politically. Climate policy has become a battleground between generations. Activists like Greta Thunberg embody the anger of the young, demanding action. Europe's geopolitical position has weakened. Between the dominant US and the rising China, the continent is looking for its own path, but often looks indecisive. Strategic autonomy remains a slogan, not a reality. Dependence on American military power has been exposed with renewed vigor in the light of the Ukrainian conflict. The media landscape was fragmented. Common sources of information have disappeared, and each group consumes its own version of reality. Trust in traditional media has fallen, and alternative sources are often manipulative. This creates parallel realities where people cannot even agree on basic facts. The COVID-19 pandemic has become a catalyst for many processes. It exposed the weaknesses of healthcare systems, accelerated digitalization, but also deepened inequality and distrust of authorities. Lockdowns have shown the fragility of personal freedoms that seemed inviolable. Anti-vaccination movements have turned from marginal to mass. The urban appearance of Europe is also changing. Gentrification is squeezing old-timers out of historical centers, turning them into museums for tourists and investment sites. The periphery feels forgotten, which fuels populism. Small towns and rural areas are losing population, services, and prospects. Family structures have transformed. The traditional model is being eroded, but the new forms have not yet gained full legitimacy in the eyes of the whole society. This is becoming another battleground in the culture wars. Fertility is falling to critical levels, and Europe is aging faster than most regions of the world. The energy transition turned out to be more painful than expected. Phasing out fossil fuels requires huge investments, and the results are slow to show up. Dependence on unstable supplies of critical materials for green technologies creates new vulnerabilities. Nuclear energy, which seemed to be a thing of the past, is returning to the agenda. Educational systems are struggling to adapt to a changing world. Traditional models are outdated, but what should replace them is unclear. Digital skills are critically important, but a liberal arts education is also essential for critical thinking. It is difficult to find a balance. Europe of the 90s believed in linear progress, that tomorrow would be better than today. The Europe of 2025 knows that progress is not guaranteed, that achievements can be lost, that history has not ended, but has returned with a vengeance. A continent that once exuded confidence is now plagued by doubts, searching for new answers to old questions about who we are, where we are going, and what we want from the future.